Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you. I think what I am going to say will build up on the previous two presentations, although most of it comes before the topics that they dealt with. This is a very well-known slogan or comment that we often hear in agriculture. But I think it's very important. Now, Lord Kelvin was the guy that established the temperature measurement instead of degrees Celsius. He's the inventor of Kelvin, and he was a big scientist. And obviously, being a scientist, he knew what the importance of proper measurement is. And I think all of us, as people who are involved in agriculture, are scientists, and we need to be measuring in very appropriately and very accurately everything that we're doing, from our production side right through to, in the end, our profitability. And the goal is to improve what we are doing, constantly to improve. And as I said, this builds on the previous two presentations, and especially with regard to water management. Now, I want to start with soil samples, with soil sampling. I think that soil sampling is probably one of the most important practices and parts of both planning to produce a crop, but also to manage a crop. And there's a few reasons why you would do soil sampling. The first is that for soil preparation, it's very important. You can't plan it properly. You need to make sure what chemical corrections you need to do during soil preparation. And Don has touched on that. It's during soil preparation is the only time that you have, the only opportunity that you have to do something about the subsoil's pH and phosphorus concentration. It's the only opportunity that you have, if you've got salinity, to properly address that as well with gypsum application. So soil sampling before soil preparation is very important. Then the next one is to ensure that you have optimal conditions for growth and that it's maintained. And it's very important, the emphasis is on maintaining optimal growth and optimal crop production. So you want to detect any imbalances, any decrease that progressively develops in your soil pH, or decrease in your phosphorus concentration in your soil, or any other nutrient, and correct that so that you can raise it to optimal level again and maintain your crop's production. And obviously this will differ from soil to soil. Some soils will have a tendency to for example, for potassium to leach out more rapidly than in other soils, and you might need to do regular soil analysis simply to monitor what's happening with your potassium in your soil or your pH. In a sandy soil, some highly leached soils, depending again on the type of fertilization that you use, you might enhance acidification of your soil, and you want to be able to monitor the rate that is happening so that you can correct it when it's necessary. Okay, then, one that we often don't see in that light is that if you are planning on your fertilization program for the coming season or long-term fertilization practices, you want to use your soil analysis to predict what the profitable reaction that you're going to have on your fertilization. Now, what I mean by this is, often producers plan their fertilization program for the year. They set it out. They get their consultant or their fertilizer agent to give them a program. And they take that program and they follow it without thinking, without proper criticism, and without actually thinking what is the fertilization program costing me compared to the impact that it's having on my crop and my quality and my profitability. And often they would fertilize a nutrient, for example, and a favorite topic of mine is calcium. They would fertilize with the calcium, they would pay for the calcium, but get no benefit out of it. Okay, because there's already sufficient calcium in the soil, the pH is optimal or higher than optimal, and they still fertilize with calcium. So that's one of the reasons why you would do a soil analysis, to establish whether there's actually value in applying without thinking certain fertilizers and actually paying for it. And then the last one is, and this is a once-off analysis, and it touches on what Miku has said, to do proper irrigation scheduling. You have to take a soil sample, and the best time to do it is during soil preparation to establish what's the soil's water holding capacity. Okay, so if I can summarize in terms of the purpose, it's the most important advantage of doing soil analysis is to detect changes in soil fertility, and I'm referring to an established crop or an established orchard, to correct problems before you have nutritional stress. Okay. So you want to monitor constantly what is happening in your soil. And often I use the example of a tree that doesn't grow properly. And you would increase your nitrogen fertilization and still don't get response. Then you'll try something else like phosphorus. Add phosphorus to that, or increase your regular phosphorus fertilization and still not get response to that. And often it's because you're not aware of the fact that you actually have suboptimal pH in your soil. So it's very important to regularly analyze soil so that you can detect any forms of chemical stress before it has an impact on your performance of your trees. So when does one sample? Soil samples it's often people ask me when do I sample? When's the best time to sample? My response is usually when's the most practical time to you. Okay, when do you have a bit of free time? Because it's always a bit of effort. It always takes labor. It always takes some arranging to do, some logistics, etc. So I think the most practical time for most people is after harvest, or during the quieter time, and which is usually late summer or winter time. It's better to do it early winter or late summer, especially if you want to apply lime and even phosphorus, etc., that you want to utilize the winter rain to wash that in still. And then the most logical one is if you want to re-establish and you want to do soil preparation, then you have to do it after the final crop of an orchard before you, and to be able to plan soil preparation. Okay, so when does one sample soil? You can actually sample it any time of the year if you're concerned about a specific aspect or for diagnostic purposes. But in a routine schedule, and it's good to do it maybe late summer, and preferably not right after you've applied a lot of fertilizer, unless you want to look at what the impact is of that. But logically, it's not wise to do it directly after or shortly after you've applied a lot of fertilizer. In existing orchards, every 3 years should be sufficient. Okay, there's many farmers that actually does it every year. And again, it depends on your soil. If you have a sandy soil, and if you drip irrigate and your wetting zone is very small, then it might be worthwhile to do it more regularly. But on average, doing a soil analysis every 3 years should be sufficient, and it's obviously wise to do it about the same time every year. How do you sample? Okay, for soil preparation, and Don has shown a picture as well. You want someone or yourself to look at the soil and identify the different horizons that exist there, especially if it's an undisturbed soil that's not been prepared previously. Then you want to establish the different horizons. If it's re-establishment, you might actually find that some horizons start developing, especially if you use a lot of organic material again. And there's definitely a difference in the chemistry of the topsoil compared to the subsoil. Even in an orchard that's 35 years, where the soil's been properly mixed, there's going to be a huge difference between the topsoil and the subsoil. You'll see it in the color that developed over time, and the chemistry will definitely differ. In that 35 years, you might have applied lime that only affected the topsoil and not the subsoil. And the same applies for phosphorus. The phosphorus that you've applied during soil preparation might be depleted in the subsoil. In the meantime, you've applied some phosphorus that only affected the topsoil. So during soil preparation, you would sample according to the different layers of soil that you identify. And then it's very important to mark those depths. If the soil is very homogeneous, okay, if you think of a Hutton soil, and you don't see very clearly defined layers, then take the samples at 3 depths. If you're going to prepare down to 90 centimeters, then take it down to 90 centimeters. But generally, up to 60 centimeters should be fine. The best time is to do it when the holes are there. You've got a bigger area that you can cover where you can sample from. And you can chisel from the whole side of the profile and combine the soil in one sample. In existing orchards, it's very important that you take a representative sample. Met 'n verteenwoordigende monster. Een wat vir jou sê wat in die boord aangaan. Okay, one that takes into account the variance of this that might occur, the slight variance. Okay, now if I say variance, if there's big variance, usually people know their orchard. They would know which part of my orchard doesn't perform, or which part is the more sandy part, and which is the part is the lesser, not so well drained area. Then you have to take those separately. But if it's a fairly homogeneous soil, there still is slight variance. Okay, and you don't necessarily have to take that into account. You want to get a good average, a representative sample, and then you'll take samples at different points in the orchard and combine them. As I said, the weak patches, you'll sample separately. Okay. When you take the samples, you have to take them on the tree row or in the area that you fertilize most intensively, where most of the roots are, which is usually on the tree row. Okay. And you can do that with an auger, with a spade. Usually you don't want to go into the orchard with a digger, but if your row width is wide enough and you want to look at the root development anyway, it's a good idea to do that, and then take your samples according to the root distribution. Okay. The depth looking at a profile and looking at your root distribution will help you in an existing orchard also to sample more accurately. Usually, one sample from 0 to 40 centimeters is sufficient if you have good root distribution, because in an existing orchard, that is the depth, even if you're lucky to go that deep, that you might be able to affect in terms of lime and phosphorus and even potassium. Okay, then if you take the sample, if you sampled at different spots in the orchard, you combine the sample into one subsample. About 1 kilogram of soil is sufficient, and you put it in a plastic bag. If there's stones and rocks present, it's very important to include the stones in the sample, even if you have to make the sample a little bit bigger. From Bemlab's side, we prefer that you rather send us a bigger sample that includes the stones and pebbles than leaving them out, because the stones and pebbles, as Don has referred to earlier, they make up the soil volume, but they're not chemically reactive, and we have to take them into account when we determine the lime requirement or phosphorus requirement. If you have big stones, as the slide that Don has said, then you have to estimate the volume of the soil and indicate that on the sample. Obviously, it's very important to identify the source of the sample in terms of the block where it came from. And if you take two separate samples, then you have to identify the weaker part and the better part, or the geiler en die swakker of die natter en die droër kol of wat ook al. Uit dieselfde blok uit. Maar gee die bloknommer, dui die bloknommer aan en baie belangrik, dui die diepte van die monster ook aan. Okay. En dan ook verkieslik die cultivar en die ouderdom van die blok. Okay, then leaf samples. Why does one analyze leaves? Often people do that every year, and they do that to fine-tune their nutrition. I often get calls from people asking me, is it really necessary to analyze their leaves? I think the most important reason why you would want to analyze leaves is for diagnostic purposes. If you suspect a nutritional deficiency, and when I'm talking about a nutritional deficiency, it doesn't necessarily mean one on the level where you see the symptoms. Because I often tell people, if you want to know whether you have a serious deficiency, you'll often see the symptoms already. But if you have poor tree performance, and you suspect that it's a nutritional imbalance or a slight deficiency, for diagnostic purposes, leaf analysis does have a lot of value. Okay. The other one is to evaluate how effective the trees are able to utilize the nutrients in the soil. Okay. Now, this touches on a diagnostic aspect. Often out of your leaf analysis, you can pick up from certain elements. Potassium, for example, is a typical element. It gives you an indication that either the soil is wet, or you have a root disease, or you have nematodes. And then it's not effective, the tree is not effectively taking up the nutrients despite you fertilizing with it. So you would have a record, and you would know how much, if I can use potassium again as an example, how much potassium you applied. Okay. And a leaf analysis will show you whether that is being used effectively or not. And it will be an indication that there's potential other problems. Soil compaction, poor root development, etc. Okay, and then last one, which is more often used now, especially I think where we heading towards the higher and increased levels of production, and that is to fine-tune your nutritional status of the plant, to get maximal plant performance. Okay, we can like it to an athlete. No athlete can perform optimally if he doesn't get all the nutrition in addition to all the other aspects. But if he doesn't get proper nutrition and he doesn't look at his diet properly, then he won't perform optimally. And he needs to have a balanced diet. Okay, very similar to a tree. If you want optimal production, optimal photosynthesis, optimal growth, which is very well balanced, etc., then you need to fine-tune the nutritional status of that plant. Okay, when do you sample? Okay, this is interesting. I think in the horticulture or in the deciduous fruit industry, we've established that there's that magical period, late January, that we sample, and it's a time of the year that works well. Okay, but you have to take into account that there's different varieties that tend to be earlier and later. Okay, and that you have a quick shift in the nutrients from your leaves to your fruit when ripening starts. And if you take the sample after the onset of ripening and before the onset of ripening, there's going to be a difference. Especially potassium and some other nutrients are being actively translocated then. So I would suggest that you you look at your orchard, look at the time of season. If you have an earlier season, then obviously you want to take your samples a week or two earlier than the previous season that was a later season. Okay, so roughly the date that I hold to you is between the middle of January and the middle of February, and within that period, establish what is the best. Is it the earlier season, and your earliest varieties you sample earlier, and the later ones you sample later. Okay. Obviously, there's other times of the year that you can take samples. If in terms of crisis management, the norms that we use by which we evaluate leaf analysis are mainly based on the late summer, or not late summer, midsummer period. So one has to make some provision and adjustments to how you evaluate that. But obviously, if there's a crisis and you want to establish whether there's a nutritional problem very quickly, then you can take the samples at another time, but then one has to take into account that the norms that you use, that we would usually use, doesn't apply. Okay, how to do leaf sampling? The best place to do it is in the middle of the current year's growth. On the shoots, okay? Take it on both sides of the tree row. Depending on the tree row, you don't want to take it only on the sunny side, but if it's a northwest, east-west tree row, but again, you want to take a representative sample of the total tree, the total orchard. Okay, so take it. You need to take a full-size mature leaf in the middle of the shoot of the current year's growth, and it's very important to take healthy leaves. Okay, one leaf per shoot is better and take it from more shoots and more trees. Okay, so the more trees that you have and the more shoots that you can take off the samples from, the more representative your sample is going to be. Okay, so at least 5 trees. Okay, in the lab we need a big enough sample. 50 leaves are sufficient. But we prefer that you bring us 100 leaves, okay, from 20 trees or 50 trees. So the more representative the sample is of your orchard, the better. The better the results, the more accurate representation you get from your orchard. And then if you have a poor spot, okay, so if you have a spot that bothers you, okay, that performs badly, sample that separately, and it's always good to sample that spot and the better spot, the better performing. So trek 'n monster in die swakker kol en trek 'n monster in die beter area, sodat jy dit kan vergelyk. Heel waarskynlik het jy beide van hulle dieselfde bemes en jy wil agterkom wat is die probleem. So trek 'n monster uit beide areas. Okay, then it's very important again to identify the block. What I haven't indicated here again, the cultivar is very, very important, and the date of sampling. And you can put it in a clean plastic bag. Often people, it's often said that you can put it in a paper bag as well. That's true, you can. The thing is, in the lab we wash the leaves, we wash off all the residues, so we prefer to get fresh leaves. And then they just last longer if you put them in a plastic bag and get them to the lab as quickly as possible. So put them in a plastic bag. It doesn't have to be a perforated one. If you keep it cool, they don't go down in 2-3 days. So get them to the lab where we will then wash off the residues. If you put it in a plastic bag, they often wilt, they often dry out, and then, obviously we can't wash dried out leaves and get rid of the residues. Then you have to work with the spray residues on the leaves that we analyze. Okay, I'm almost done. Just quickly, because I don't have the time, and obviously we can't talk about plant nutrition here for a long term. I want to focus on just what's the most important macro and micronutrients, and quickly what's their role. If I could get this thing to move on. The plant nutrients has been classified into 3 groups. The first group is the macronutrients, and if you buy a bag of fertilizer, you would usually have the concentration of your macronutrients, NP, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium indicated there in that ratio of 1 to 5:1:5 or whatever. That always indicate to your macronutrients. The other nutrients that's also considered macronutrients, but they talk about the secondary ones, is calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. Okay, so they're often also included in your fertilizer. Calcium nitrate, for example, or ammonium sulfate, etc., will include sulfur and calcium. There's lesser fertilizers that contain in mixtures magnesium, and also generally the plant requires less magnesium compared to calcium and nitrogen and potassium. These three are probably the three that has the largest effect and impact on tree performance and crop quality. We all know how important calcium is for fruit quality, but even before calcium, these three impact your tree performance in terms of metabolism, photosynthesis, etc., hugely. And these three are usually the three that when you suffer deficiency will have the biggest impact on your tree performance. Then we have the micronutrients, which is very important as well. If any of those are at deficient levels and not in sufficient levels available to the tree, they will have a huge impact as well on the tree's performance. But they're called micronutrients because they are literally in micro amounts required by your tree. If we talk about nitrogen, 150, 200 kilograms per hectare. We talk about iron, zinc, 100, 150 grams per hectare. So it's 1,000 times less than you would have of your than is the requirement of your macronutrients. What's the role of all these nutrients? It's difficult to discuss all of them. I've got the most important roles or functions listed here. I want to highlight quickly a few. Nitrogen is very important in building proteins. Proteins are the part of your the plant cell and all of our cells that makes up the RNA and DNA that carries the genetic properties. You don't get proper plant cell division without sufficient proteins being produced, and then amino acids. So nitrogen is one of the most important nutrients. It's part of chlorophyll as well. Phosphorus is part of ATP, and ATP is the die verbinding. Wat's 'n verbinding in Engels? Sorry, I can't hear. The compound or whatever. That plays the most important role in energy transfer during photosynthesis. So if you don't have sufficient phosphorus in the plant, you don't have sufficient or optimal photosynthesis. You don't have proper sugar production. Okay. Potassium is a catalyst. It stimulates and it regulates most of the metabolic activities in the plant. The production of color, the pigments, most of the activities where enzymes are involved in, sugar production, acid production, etc., it's involved there. And then also it regulates the water in the plant. Okay, it's the element that's being transferred in and out of your stomata to regulate that. So a plant that doesn't have sufficient potassium would show very quickly water stress symptoms. Okay, calcium is, and there it's indicated it's a cell wall component. It's very important in cell walls. It creates cell wall stability, and that's why it's one of the most important elements in fruit quality, in establishing fruit quality, firmness of fruit as well. I think I'm going to stop there with the roles of the different nutrients. These, obviously, when you do plant analysis, all of these are reported, and you can establish what's your nutritional status of the plant. And Dan has referred to Justus von Liebig's VAT, where if one of them are deficient, okay, that one is the limiting factor. That nutrient is the limiting factor that prevents the tree from performing optimally. So through leaf analysis, you can establish which one of these are potentially, or are there one that is a limiting factor. Okay. In the case of soil analysis, we don't analyze for nitrogen, and this is another discussion. But nitrogen is, the rate that nitrogen is being released from organic material differs. It's a nutrient that can leach out very rapidly. So soil analysis for nitrogen is usually not regarded as one that has got a lot of value, and you manage your nitrogen fertilization by evaluating the tree growth and your vegetative growth, rather than trying to build up a pool of nitrogen in the soil. Okay, I'm going to finish by just saying that this is a quote from a lady that I don't know, but I thought it's a very good quote. She said that one accurate measurement is worth 1,000 expert opinions. Now, if you can picture you walking into the orchard and you're not happy with the performance of this orchard, and you get people to come and look at the orchard, and each one of them's got an opinion, the chances are very good, if it's a good agronomists or agriculturalists, at one point they're going to ask you, have you looked at your soil? Do you know what your soil chemistry is? Okay. And the people can have a lot of opinions. What is wrong? But if you don't do accurate measurement, okay, all the opinions of people doesn't have any weight unless you know and you've measured properly the aspects that you can actually affect. And that is where soil analysis and leaf analysis plays such an important role. And finally, what I just want to give you is, I think it's a worthwhile investment. If you look at the cost of soil analysis and the leaf analysis compared to, and I don't work in the fertilizer industry, and it's been 12 years since I had to buy fertilizer for a farm, but I estimate, from what I hear, a normal fertilization program is roughly between 5,000 and 10,000 rand per hectare. Then, if that soil and leaf analysis can help you to save between 2 and 4% of your total fertilizer cost, you've paid for that analysis. Okay. So I think it's a worthwhile investment. Okay. Thank you.